I'm 31, and I live just outside of Denver. A few weeks ago, I had to drive home late at night after a grueling business trip. It was around midnight, and I'd been on the road for hours. My eyes were heavy, my body aching from sitting for so long. The highway was almost deserted, with only the occasional car speeding by. Eventually, exhaustion got the better of me, and I decided to pull into a rest stop to stretch my legs and wake myself up. The parking lot was eerily quiet. A single streetlight flickered, casting long, distorted shadows across the pavement. There were only 2 cars parked there, mine and an old, beat-up minivan sitting at the far end of the lot. It looked abandoned at first, but something about it felt off. I got out of my car, shivering in the cold night air. The silence was heavy, like the world had paused around me. I stretched and yawned, trying to shake off the uneasiness creeping up my spine. That's when I heard it, a faint, muffled sound. At first, I thought it was just the wind rustling through the nearby trees. But then it grew louder. It sounded like crying. I froze, glancing around the empty lot. The sound was coming from the direction of the minivan. I told myself to ignore it, to get back in my car and drive away. But something about the crying pulled me in. It was soft yet desperate, like a child in distress. Against every instinct screaming at me to leave, I started walking toward the minivan. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if some invisible force was urging me to turn back. The crying grew clearer, sharper, cutting through the cold night air. When I reached the van, I peered through the back window. My heart sank. There was a child inside, maybe 6 or 7 years old, banging on the glass. His face was streaked with tears, and he looked terrified. I hesitated, my mind racing. Where were his parents? Why was he alone? My gut told me something wasn't right, but I couldn't just leave him there. I reached for the door handle, and to my surprise, it was unlocked. I opened the door cautiously, leaning in just enough to ask, "Hey, are you okay? Where are your parents?" The child didn't answer. He just stared past me, his wide, tear-filled eyes fixed on something behind me. A chill ran down my spine. Before I could turn around, I heard a deep, gravelly voice. "You shouldn't have done that." I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. Standing there was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, with a hood pulled over his face. In his hand was a crowbar, its metal glinting under the flickering streetlight. Pure panic set in, and I bolted toward my car. My heart was pounding so hard it drowned out everything else. I could hear his footsteps behind me, heavy and fast. As I reached my car, my hands fumbled with the keys. My fingers were trembling so much I almost dropped them. Just as I got the door unlocked and threw myself inside, he slammed the crowbar against my window. The sound was deafening, and for a split second, I thought the glass would shatter. He raised the crowbar again, yelling something I couldn't make out. I scrambled to start the engine, my entire body shaking. The moment the car roared to life, I slammed my foot on the gas. The tires screeched as I sped out of the lot, my headlights cutting through the darkness. In the rearview mirror, I saw him standing there, the crowbar hanging at his side, watching me disappear into the night. Once I was a safe distance away, I grabbed my phone and called the police, barely able to get the words out. I told them everything. The crying child, the man with the crowbar, the minivan. They assured me they would send someone to check the rest stop immediately. Later that night, an officer called me back. They found the minivan, but it was empty. No sign of the man or the child. The officer then told me something that made my stomach churn. The minivan matched the description of a vehicle connected to multiple disappearances along the highway. Women traveling alone had been lured in by the sound of a crying child, only to be attacked and never seen again. I was the first one who had managed to get away. I couldn't stop thinking about the child. Was he real? Or was he just part of the trap? I'll never know. But that night changed me forever. I still drive that route occasionally, but I refuse to stop, no matter how tired I am. I don't care if I'm running on fumes or about to fall asleep at the wheel. I'll never pull into a rest stop again. Some nights, when I'm lying in bed, I replay it all in my head. The sound of the crowbar against my window, the man's gravelly voice, the child's terrified face. It's all burned into my memory. And the scariest part, he's still out there, waiting for his next victim. My name's Michael. I'm 34 years old, and I live in Portland, Oregon. A few months ago, I had to drive out of state for a work conference. It was a 6-hour drive, and since I'd left later than planned, it was already dark when I hit the road. The rain hadn't stopped since noon, making the drive feel even longer. I've always hated driving at night, especially in bad weather. About halfway through my trip, I saw him. A man standing on the side of the road, drenched and shivering, holding out his thumb. His clothes were soaked through, and he looked miserable. Normally, I would have driven right past him. I've never been the kind of person to pick up hitchhikers. It just feels too risky. But something about him made me hesitate. He didn't look threatening. He was thin, maybe in his late 40s, with a pale face and a defeated expression. The rain was pouring so hard I could barely see him as I slowed down. Against my better judgment, I pulled over. As soon as I rolled down the window, he leaned in and stammered, thank you so much. My car broke down a few miles back. I just need a ride to the next town." I hesitated, my instincts screaming at me to drive away, but the desperation in his voice made me feel guilty. I unlocked the passenger door, and he climbed in, dripping water all over the seat. "Thank you," he said again, shivering as he buckled his seatbelt. "I've been out there for hours." "No problem," I replied, forcing a smile. "Where are you headed?" He mentioned a small town about 20 minutes up the road. As we started driving, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling creeping over me. Something about him didn't sit right. At first, he made small talk, where I was headed, what I did for work, but his answers about himself were vague. He said his car had broken down, but when I asked what kind of car he drove, he paused for a moment too long before answering. A sit-in. He didn't mention a make or model. The conversation died after that. The only sounds were the rain pounding on the roof and the windshield wipers scraping back and forth. I glanced at him out of the corner of my eye. He was staring straight ahead, his hands resting stiffly on his lap. His wet clothes clung to his body, and his breathing sounded uneven. The uneasy feeling grew stronger. I couldn't pinpoint why, but something was off. About 10 minutes later, we passed a gas station. "I'm going to stop here real quick," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. He immediately tensed. "Why? Just keep driving. The town isn't far." I forced a laugh. "I need to fill up, and I could use some coffee. It'll only take a minute." "No," he said sharply. "I don't want to stop." That's when the alarm bells in my head started screaming. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, and my heart began to race. "I'll just be a second," I said firmly, pulling into the gas station despite his protest. As I parked, he leaned toward me. His voice dropped, and he said, "You're making a mistake." I froze. The way he said it sent chills down my spine. I couldn't tell if it was a threat or a warning. "I'll be right back," I muttered, trying to sound casual. I grabbed my wallet and stepped out of the car, my legs shaking. The gas station clerk, a young guy who looked barely out of high school, greeted me as I walked in. I forced a smile and whispered, "I think the guy in my car is dangerous. Can you call the police?" The clerk's eyes widened, but he nodded and quickly disappeared into the back room. I pretended to browse the snack aisle, keeping an eye on my car. The man was still sitting there, but now he was watching me. His eyes followed my every move, and I felt trapped under his gaze. A few minutes later, 2 police cars pulled into the lot, their lights flashing. As soon as the man saw them, he threw open the passenger door and bolted into the ring. The officers chased after him, and within minutes, they had him in handcuffs. One of them came over to talk to me while the other searched the man. "Are you okay?" the officer asked. "Yeah," I stammered, still shaking. He said his car broke down, but something about him didn't feel right. The officer nodded grimly. "Good instincts. He's been on our radar for a while. He's wanted for the murder of 2 drivers who picked him up on this highway. You're lucky you stopped here." I felt my stomach drop. The man I'd let into my car, who I'd driven for miles, had killed people in my exact situation. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying everything in my head, wondering what would have happened if I hadn't stopped at the gas station. Now, every time I see someone hitchhiking, I feel a pang of guilt. But I reminded myself of that night. No matter how desperate someone looks, I'll never pick up a hitchhiker again. My name is Alex Carter. I'm 28 years old and live in the suburbs of Chicago. I've always been cautious by nature, never the kind of guy to take unnecessary risks. But that night, my judgment failed me. That night, I learned that some roads are better left unexplored. I was driving home after visiting an old friend I hadn't seen in years. The reunion was nice, but it had run later than I'd planned. By the time I got on the road, it was nearing 1 a.m., and I still had over an hour to go. I was exhausted, just trying to stay awake. The route was mostly rural, with long stretches of dark, empty roads. My GPS chimed, instructing me to take a left turn onto a dirt road. I hesitated. The road looked narrow, surrounded by thick woods, and there weren't any streetlights. I considered ignoring it and sticking to the main highway, but I was too tired to argue with the GPS. I turned, my tires crunching against the gravel. As I drove, the road seemed to stretch endlessly into the dark. My headlights illuminated nothing but trees and dirt. No signs, no landmarks, just isolation. I started to feel uneasy. I'd always heard stories about people going missing on roads like this, but I told myself to stop overthinking. That's when I saw it. A car was parked on the side of the road, its hazard lights blinking weakly. Standing next to it was a man, waving his arms like he was trying to flag me down. My heart rate spiked. He looked desperate, pacing back and forth. I slowed down, unsure of what to do. As I got closer, I noticed the man's clothes were dirty, like he'd been out here for a while. He ran up to my window, yelling something I couldn't hear over the engine. I rolled it down slightly, just enough to catch his words. "Please, my wife's hurt. She's in the car. I need help." His voice cracked, full of panic. Every instinct told me to drive away. Something felt off. But then I thought, what if he's telling the truth? I didn't want to leave someone stranded if they were in real trouble. Reluctantly, I put the car in park and stepped out. "Where is she?" I asked, my voice shaky. "In the back seat," he said, pointing to the car. I approached cautiously, my eyes scanning the vehicle. The back seat was empty. "Where is she?" I repeated, turning back to him. That's when I noticed his hands. They were trembling, not with fear, but with some kind of suppressed energy, like he was holding back from doing something. Before I could process it, I heard movement behind me. A second man emerged from the woods, holding a crowbar. His face was shadowed, but his intent was clear. Adrenaline kicked in. I bolted back to my car, not even thinking, just running. I heard them shouting behind me, their footsteps pounding against the dirt. I barely managed to fling the door open and slam it shut before the first man reached me. I locked the doors and floored it. Gravel sprayed from my tires as I sped away, the men shrinking in my rearview mirror. My heart was racing so fast, I thought it might explode. After what felt like forever, I saw the glow of a gas station up ahead. I pulled in, shaking, and ran inside to tell the clerk what had happened. He listened quietly, his expression darkening as I described the dirt road. "That road doesn't lead anywhere," he said. "It's a dead end." I didn't sleep that night. I kept thinking about what would have happened if I hadn't run. Now, I don't trust GPS blindly anymore. Some roads aren't shortcuts. They're traps. I wasn't the type to get sentimental over high school, but flipping through my freshly printed yearbook brought back a weird mix of nostalgia and relief. Graduation was only a few days away, and I was more than ready to move on. I was lying on my bed, absent-mindedly scanning the pages, laughing at dumb inside jokes scribbled by my friends. That's when I noticed something off. There was a picture from the homecoming game, one of those wide shots capturing the student section. Something about the crowd made me squint. There, in the back, barely visible but unmistakable, was a man. He wasn't cheering, wasn't even dressed like a student or a parent. He just stood there, slightly blurred, like he wasn't supposed to be in the shot. I flipped a few more pages. Another candid, this one from a pep rally. My stomach sank. He was there again, standing in the back near the gym doors. Same blank expression, same posture. My mind tried to rationalize it. Maybe a teacher, a staff member. But something about him felt wrong. I turned the pages faster now, scanning random photos. There he was at the senior bonfire. A group of students were laughing, their faces illuminated by the flames, and just outside the firelight's reach, the man stood watching. No one acknowledged him. No one even seemed to notice he was there. I felt my pulse quicken. It wasn't until I reached the group photos that the unease turned to outright fear. I found the picture of me and my friends, taken on the last day of school. We were all standing in front of the lockers, arms slung over each other's shoulders, smiling. But right behind us, slightly out of focus, was the man. He was standing directly behind me. And this time, he was smiling too. A cold shiver ran through my body. I slammed the yearbook shut. My heart was racing, but I kept telling myself it was some weird editing mistake. Maybe someone photoshopped him in as a joke. Maybe it was just some random guy who had been around and no one noticed. I tried to put it out of my head. That night, while packing for college, my phone buzzed with a text. I'd assumed it was one of my friends making plans for graduation, but when I checked the screen, my stomach dropped. Unknown number. See you at graduation. I just stared at it, my hands suddenly clammy. My brain fought between wanting to dismiss it as a prank and the overwhelming dread creeping up my spine. I typed back, "Who is this?" No response. I didn't sleep much that night. Every shadow in my room felt too dark, every sound too sharp. I even checked the locks twice before finally forcing myself to lie down. The next day at school, I asked around. No one else seemed to notice the man in the yearbook. Not my friends, not the teachers. Even the yearbook staff had no idea who I was talking about. They pulled up the raw files, and in the original shots, he wasn't there. But in the printed copies, he was. I tried to brush it off, to pretend none of it mattered. Graduation day came, and the whole ceremony felt like a blur. It wasn't until after I walked across the stage, diploma in hand, that I saw him again, standing at the very back of the auditorium. He was grinning. And this time, he raised his hand, just slightly, and waved. I left town the next morning. I don't know who he was, and I don't want to know. But sometimes, late at night, I still get messages from an unknown number. I never answer them. I still think about this night sometimes. Even years later, the memory creeps back when I least expect it. I was never the kind of person to believe in the paranormal, but what happened at my college graduation made me question everything. It was a warm evening, and the ceremony was being held outdoors on the university's football field. Rows of white chairs stretched across the grass, each filled with anxious graduates dressed in identical caps and gowns. I was sitting toward the middle, waiting for my name to be called. The air buzzed with nervous excitement. Occasional bursts of laughter, the murmurs of students whispering to each other. The occasional call of a professor reminding us to stay in line. At first, it was just a passing observation, something my brain registered but didn't dwell on. A girl, sitting at the very end of the row. She was wearing a cap and gown like the rest of us, but something about her was off. Her skin was unnaturally pale, almost grayish under the stadium lights. And she sat perfectly still, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She didn't fidget, didn't whisper to anyone, didn't even seem to blink. I kept stealing glances at her, feeling a weird sense of unease. It wasn't just her stillness. It was the way no one else seemed to acknowledge her. The students on either side of her left a noticeable gap, as if they were unconsciously avoiding sitting too close. The name-calling continued. One by one, students walked up, shook hands with the dean, and took their diplomas. Cheers erupted with every name, parents, friends, classmates all clapping, shouting. But she never reacted, never clapped, never turned her head to watch. Then, it happened. The announcer cleared his throat and read a name. Anna Holloway. Silence. No claps, no cheers, not a single sound. I looked around, expecting someone to call out or react, but no one did. The announcer hesitated, shifting uncomfortably at the microphone, as if realizing something was wrong. Then, after an awkward pause, he quickly moved on to the next name, and the moment passed as if it had never happened. But I couldn't let it go. The name felt familiar, and that girl, she still hadn't moved. A strange sensation crawled up my spine, and for the first time, I noticed something else. The wind had been blowing all night, making our gowns ripple slightly as we sat. But hers didn't move at all. The rest of the ceremony passed in a blur. I barely registered my own name being called, my legs feeling stiff as I walked across the stage. The only thing I could focus on was her. Every time I glanced back, she was still there, still staring forward. After the final name was called and the hats were tossed into the air, I found myself scanning the crowd, searching for her, but she was gone. I hadn't seen her stand. I hadn't seen her leave. She had just vanished. Something about it gnawed at me. Maybe it was my brain trying to rationalize what I saw, or maybe it was pure unease. But I needed to know. After the ceremony, I approached one of the faculty members, an older professor who had been handing out the diplomas. I asked him, as casually as I could, who Anna Holloway was. His reaction was instant. His expression darkened, his mouth opened slightly like he wanted to say something but stopped himself. Then, after a pause, he gave a small shake of his head. She wasn't on the list. I laughed nervously, thinking he misunderstood. No, I heard her name announced. She was sitting at the end of the row. Pale girl, black hair, really quiet. The professor stared at me for a long time. Then, in a hushed voice, he said, Anna Holloway was supposed to graduate 5 years ago. She died in a car accident a week before the ceremony. A cold, heavy weight settled in my stomach. That can't be right, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I saw her. She was there. I swear. He only shook his head. I don't know what you saw, but she wasn't on the list. I left without another word. That night, I searched the university's records, digging through old class rosters. And there it was. Anna Holloway, class of 2018. My hands felt clammy as I clicked on an old article. The headline sent a chill down my spine. Tragic accident claims life of promising student days before graduation. Anna had been driving home late from a study session when her car skidded on black ice and flipped into a ditch. She had died instantly. I stared at the screen for what felt like hours. The girl I saw at graduation, her pale skin, her motionless posture, the way no one sat too close to her. It all made sense now. I closed my laptop, trying to push away the growing fear inside me. Maybe it had been a mistake. Maybe I imagined her. Maybe I was just tired. But then I remembered the silence. Every single student received cheers, claps, whistles. Except for her, somewhere deep down, I knew. I had seen her. She had been there. And no one noticed. Except me. Graduation night had always been billed as a moment of triumph and celebration. A time to mark the end of college life and the beginning of something new. I'd remember the buzz of excitement as I donned my cap and gown, the lingering sense of perfume and sweat in the crowded auditorium, and the applause that reverberated off the walls as names were called. After the ceremony, the building emptied out quickly. Most of my classmates had already gone off to their parties or family gatherings, leaving the auditorium quiet and strangely empty. I was among the last to leave, reluctant to let go of the moment. It wasn't until I reached my car that I realized I'd left my phone charger behind. I cursed my forgetfulness. My phone was already dangerously close to dying, and I needed it for directions home. With no other option, I decided to return to the auditorium. A building that still held the echoes of the ceremony and the nervous energy of our last moments as students. Entering the auditorium again felt different in the fading light. The main hall, once brimming with life, now lay in near silence, illuminated only by a few dim emergency lights. The janitor, an older man whose tired eyes and slow, deliberate movements told of years spent alone in these halls, was busy sweeping confetti from the stage. His presence was oddly comforting in a place that otherwise felt abandoned. I retraced my steps back to my seat in the second row, where I remembered leaving my charger. With each step, I noticed the eerie hush that contrasted sharply with the celebratory chaos of just hours before. The silence was punctuated only by the soft rustle of my sneakers against the cold floor and the distant hum of the building settling. As I knelt down, reaching for my charger, a strange heaviness in the air made my skin crawl. That's when I heard it, a soft, deliberate sound that didn't match my own movements. I froze. It was the unmistakable sound of footsteps, echoing across the stage in a slow, measured pace. I glanced up toward the stage and saw a figure standing in the center. Dressed in a cap and gown identical to mine, the person was facing away, standing unnaturally still as if caught in a moment that defied time. At first, I thought it must be another student who'd forgotten something. A friend perhaps lost in thought or caught in the nostalgia of the night. Summoning the courage to speak, I called out, "Hey, did you forget something?" My voice wavered in the silence, uncertain if it would be met with an answer. For a long, agonizing moment, nothing happened. The figure remained motionless, and the janitor continued his slow sweep along the stage, seemingly oblivious to the strange occurrence. Then, in a voice that was barely more than a whisper, came the words. Did they say my name? I felt my heart sink into my stomach. That voice, it was hauntingly familiar. I remember the news from last summer. A student from our class had died in a tragic accident. Rumors had swirled, and the memory of that friend, whose name was never formally announced during the ceremony, had been seared into my mind. Now, before me, stood someone who should not have been there. My mind raced as I tried to comprehend what I was witnessing. The figure slowly turned its head, revealing a face that was unsettlingly blank, a face that seemed to be caught between life and something else. I couldn't tell if the eyes held remorse or if they were simply empty. I asked again, voiced barely above a whisper, Are you? Okay. But the figure did not respond with a reassuring nod or a simple yes. Instead, that chilling whisper repeated, "Did they say my name?" The repetition sent shivers down my spine. It wasn't just a question. It was an accusation, a plea, and a summons all at once. Paralysis gripped me. Every instinct screamed to flee, to run out of that building as fast as possible. Yet I stood rooted to the spot, transfixed by the unspeakable horror before me. Finally, as if the weight of dread had been too much to bear, I turned and bolted from the auditorium. I barely noticed if the janitor or any other presence was following. My only thought was escape. Outside, the cool night air never felt so welcoming as it did in that frantic moment. I didn't stop until I was safely in my car, the engine's hum a small comfort in the midst of my racing heart and frantic thoughts. I left the charger behind on that cold, empty floor, along with something else I wished I could forget. The next day, I returned to the auditorium. Half to recover my charger, half to understand what I'd witnessed. The room was as I had left it, but the charger was nowhere to be found. It was as if it had vanished into thin air, leaving only the unsettling memory of that encounter behind. To this day, I'm left with a lingering question and an unshakable sense of dread. Was it a trick of the light, my exhausted mind, or something far more sinister? A restless spirit seeking recognition on what was supposed to be a joyous night? I may never know the full truth, and perhaps that is for the best. The memory of that whispered question continues to haunt me, an eerie reminder that some moments should remain unexplained.